main focus, I know, our main focus is this, and that they can hear me. So I'm not as long as this works, I'm very happy to. So I think the most important thing is to see that.
Then her microphone goes in the chapel vestry.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. I already saw it flying off.
I saw it many times. Let's secure it.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome you back to the Co-Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist. I am Ulrike McGregor, and I'm excited to see you all again. Can you hear me? We were really trying to work on the audio and improve it this week. So I'm happy to see you all, and also welcome everyone on the live stream tonight. For our second session of our reflection on Lent and the events of Easter through classical art. Similar to last week, I have chosen 3 works of art for us to explore in greater detail tonight. The first work, which is also the oldest work in our series, is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. This mural was painted and is one of the best known works of Christian art, and it is a masterpiece of Italian High Renaissance. It is of enormous cultural importance and an exemplary work of art to explore 2 significant technical advances which occurred in the 15th century, influencing art forever. One of these advances was linear perspective, which allowed depiction of 3-dimensional physical reality of space or of the human forms on 2-dimensional surfaces. The second advance was the refined and brilliant modified readoption of oil as a binding medium for paintings. I would like to briefly explore these 2 advances with some telling examples before starting our reflection on tonight's 3 chosen paintings. Before the invention of linear perspective, artists painted people or objects on top of each other when they wanted to show them behind each other. The Massagio of Duce and the Wilton diptych from the 14th century are examples of this technique, as we can see in these pictures. Artists always had the notion that objects that were further away looked smaller and objects closer to us looked bigger. However, until the 15th century, there was no good way of depicting this. Around 1416, the Italian artist and architect Filippo Brunelleschi developed the conceptual theories for linear perspective, which allowed him to draw buildings and spaces that looked exactly as they did in real life. Linear perspective created the illusion of depth on flat surfaces. As illustrated, As illustrated here, orthogonal lines, they're also called diagonal lines, converge in a vanishing point placed on a horizon line. Here, the vanishing point is here. So the actual fresco of the schematic that we just saw on the slide before is the delivery of the keys to St. Peter by Perugino, which you can see on your left. Another beautiful example for linear perspective is a fresco of the Holy Trinity by Massagio, where we can see the orthogonal lines in the ceiling. If we would follow the ceiling right down here and all connect them, they would all come together in the vanishing point down here on the line of the horizon. The new sense of depth from linear perspective is clear in these paintings. I think it's an amazing, in direct comparison to the earlier paintings we saw, what a dramatic difference this made. You can imagine walking onto the plaza and being one of the people standing in the space. The second remarkable advance in the 15th century was the modified use of paint. Slightly simplified, we can say paint consists of two principal parts. It's the colored pigments and the binding medium that holds the pigments in place. Pigments came from natural world, either from colored minerals, or there were natural products such as dyes and resins obtained from plant and animal sources. Many of the pigments were prepared by grinding the color material on a stone slab or in a bronze mortar. A particularly well-known pigment is the ultramarine, a mineral pigment extracted from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli. Its only known source during the Renaissance were the mines of Sar-e-Sang in northeastern Afghanistan. It is more expensive than gold to use that particular pigment. And here we see a beautiful, this is a detail of the wooden diptych, how beautiful the color of the ultramarine is. And it was usually reserved for the most important figure in a painting because of its cost. In terms of binding medium, three main alternatives had been developed. The first one is egg tempera. This type of binding medium was extensively used until the 15th century. For egg tempera, the powderized pigments were mixed with either a whole egg or just an egg yolk. And here's a brief extraction from the Craftsman Handbook that was published in 1437, which provides detailed instructions for artists how to make up their paint. In that book, the author Cennini describes how different types of human skin should be painted. So I quote, "For a young person of fresh complexion, the yolk of a town hen should be used because it is paler. While for aged person, the yolk of a country egg is good because of its redness." So, the end of quote. I think from now on, we all might spend a little bit more, pay a bit more attention to our egg yolks when we prepare our scrambled eggs. So I thought that was very interesting. The advantages of egg tempera are that paint is resistant to light and it color does not darken or change with age, which we have often seen with other paintings, or that's a real problem with paintings over centuries. On the other hand, egg tempera dries very quickly, which means that the artist had to work on very small areas at a time, building up successive layers of glazes using small strokes and cross hatches. And in this detail, we actually can see all the minute little brush strokes that the artist had to use to build up the image. The second alternative was the fresco technique, which was used for painting murals. Here, the artist used water-based paints. Fresco is the Italian word for fresh. In art, it means the technique of applying water-based paint into damp plaster. The painting then becomes part of the wall's permanent surface. Fresco is used to describe both the technique and the painting. Of course, the greatest example of fresco is the creation of man by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, as you can see here on the screen. And then I think it also, as we see it a little bit closer than you would see it in the Sistine Chapel, it has this beautiful illusion and feel of watercolor. I think it flows very nicely. The third well-known medium is oil, in particular using linseed oil, walnut oil, and poppy oil. And it was very important to use these specific oils rather than, for example, olive oil that had been used before because of their properties, how they would dry. And so trying out different oils and narrowing it down to linseed, walnut, and poppy seed oil was very important. Because oil paint had been known before the 15th century. However, Van Eyck, a Flemish painter, and some of his contemporaries brought the practice of oil painting to a new, extraordinary high level of refinement and brilliance of execution, as the Ruffini portrait, which was painted in 1434, demonstrates. Before, it was nearly impossible to create textures, and I hope you can see that, as we can see here in the room of the woman, where you could, if you would blow into it, you could see individual hair of her fur lining. The great advantage of oil as a binding medium was a fuller, translucent, glowing quality of the colors, compared to the rather flatness of the egg tempera. The painting also dries more slowly, allowing the artist time to blend them into soft, continuous transitions. As we will discover, the combination of both egg tempera and oil paint as binder were used. Sometimes they were mixed together in a medium known as tempera rasa. So with this little bit of technical background, I think it's time to start with our first work of art, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius who, amongst other things, was a painter, mathematician, engineer, architect, botanist, sculptor, and anatomist. His detailed knowledge of anatomy, light, botany, and geology helped him creating some of the most renowned masterpieces in history, such as the Virgin of the Rocks and the Mona Lisa. The Last Supper is a mural of large size. It measures 15 by 29 feet, and it occupies the end wall of the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grassi in Milan. And I had the pleasure of actually seeing it in person. It is an exceptionally complex work,
whose mathematical symbolism, psychological complexity, use of perspective, and dramatic focus makes it the first real example of high Renaissance aesthetics. As we have talked briefly about pigments and the combination with different binding media for particular uses, unfortunately, Leonardo, although he was a master of the use of the newly established oil paint, experimented when he created this work, which is actually not a fresco, but rather he used a combination of oil and tempera on drywall. So a fresco would be using damp plaster and working right into it. Here he put on plaster, let it dry, and then used a mix of oil and tempera to paint on it. And he wanted to do that because it was giving him more flexibility. He was able to make changes with a fresco that's very difficult to do. And unfortunately, because of that, it hadn't been really tried out before. Already during his lifetime, the painting started to deteriorate. It has been, restorations have been taken place many times, and it's believed that probably only 20% of the original paint remains on the wall these days. So let's start our reflection. We'd like you to focus on the painting, either here or on your handouts, and I will read out 2 sentences of the Gospel by John. So John 13:21 to 22. I quote, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. End of quote. With this in mind, I would like now to turn it over to the audience again and to see if someone can help me out to read this picture, read this painting. Yes, please?
So you can see in the back that there is a person that has a finger up, and you wonder if that's the one that did the finger.
Yes, exactly. So this is Thomas. And exactly, so in this painting, Leonardo da Vinci foretells the story where Thomas doesn't believe until he touches Jesus' wood. Very good. Any other suggestions? What about the main figure? Obviously, is anything? Is something different between the depiction of the disciples versus the depiction of Jesus? And you also have the names of the disciples. I thought that was just a neat addition, just to know who the disciples are. And I think we have that as well. So, any suggestions? Yeah.
The 2 colors, the red and blue, signify the 2 natures or something like that.
Sorry, that's the beginning of it?
Sorry, the 2 colors, the red and the blue. Is that like the 2 natures? Or what? Or something like that?
So the gentleman was wondering about the 2 colors of Jesus. That's like the 2 natures of the disciples.
Of the person?
Of the person? Okay. Yeah, I think again it's because we have to remember this is not in its original brilliance. So I'm assuming that this would have been ultramarine, this would have been blue and red, which those 2 colors are preserved for depicting Christ. So, and usually he wears a robe and then an outer garment on top of that.
One more. If you take a look at, is it Judas? You'll see that there's a sack of money
Yes.
there. So, what is interesting, like you said, they each have the story of each of the disciples wondering if it is I who betrayed him. And again, just the beauty of it, so thank you for reading that gospel.
Yeah. Exactly. And I have. So yes, so here, and let me go there. We have so this is what you have as well, and then here. So I was able to find in the internet where you can go in and really kind of bring out the details. So yes, this is Judah, and he's holding the money pouch. So he had just had already received the 30 silver coins from the Jews. And one other little detail that you can see on the other image, he tossed over a little salt cellar, and that is a signal, or a symbol for betrayal. Yes?
What I noticed about the painting, just jumping out at me, is that Jesus is in front of a window, which highlights his appearance, but his persona as well, with the brilliant sky blue behind him and with the red of his garment. And to me, that just says this is the important person in this painting.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, no, that's absolutely wonderful. That's really very much what Leonardo had in mind, what he wanted to bring out. As we can see, because he didn't give any of the disciples or Jesus a halo, but exactly the light from the background, and there's a little arch, which is again hard to see on the image, but it could be read as a halo. Yes, exactly. Very nice. Similarly, Jesus, if you could just go back. I'm unfortunately, I can't use my mouse to. Yeah, one more. There. So also, Jesus is the central figure, and he is the absolute center of the picture. As you can, I have to give also a picture showing the orthogonal lines and the horizontal lines. In a moment, I can show that. And his head is the dead center of the painting. He's also a triangular-like shape, which again is very stable, makes the picture very stable. So he's grounded in the picture. One other thing is when we look at the disciples a little bit more, they in groups. So there's always 3 of the disciples kind of grouped together. So we have 4 groups of 3 disciples each, and they're kind of very much interacting with each other. However, Jesus is isolated, so there's no overlap with any of the disciples, where he says. And if we would go from the left to the right, which I kind of like to do, I think what Leonardo tried to do is also, he picked a very explosive moment during the Last Supper. A lot of other things happened, and I will go into that a little bit. But to pick that moment when he says, I know someone will betray me, that set off kind of a bit of fireworks. So all the disciples responded in a different way to that particular revelation. So to the far left, you can see probably dismay and surprise in the faces. And then the second group, which is we touched already on Judas, he's taking it back a little bit, and his face is also the only one that's in shadow a little bit, and we can't really read it. He also physically sits lower than everyone else. So I think again, Leonardo da Vinci wanted to make a point of that a little bit. Also to point out, Leonardo da Vinci was the first painter until that time to keep Judas on the same side of the table. If you look at older Last Supper depiction, Judas used to be depicted on the other side of the table, just to already separate him from everyone else. But Leonardo da Vinci kept him on the same side. And then there's Peter, and on the larger pictures, the zoom, the detail, because he's also actually holding a knife or a dagger. And that's all sort of foretelling, when we think about it, during the betrayal, Peter comes out and he cuts off the knife of one of the soldiers. So again, Leonardo already put that in here, so for us to think about that along this line. This is John. He was the youngest of the apostles, and he's swooned. I mean, he's just devastated. I think he's very devastated. And then on the third group, we already identified Thomas, and I think the other, James is shocked, and Philip, he wants an explanation, more or less, and then I think these ones are kind of turning to Simon to get answers. So there's a lot of emotion, and I think that's also rather new, or one of the telling examples of High Renaissance, that the painters pick particular moments in a story or in a history that they want to bring out. So they were very much interested in the emotion and feelings of the subjects. Just one other kind of technical thing, there's always a reference to the number 3. So we have 3 disciples, we have the 3 windows that you mentioned. Again, Jesus is a triangular shape, and that can be interpreted. Leonardo da Vinci wanted to make a reference to the Holy Trinity as well. So Leonardo da Vinci chose to depict a particular dramatic moment of the Last Supper, the foretelling of Jesus' betrayal. But of course, the Last Supper, one of the central moments in our Christian faith, was so much more. Jesus predicted Peter's denial. He imbued the Passover with a new meaning. He instituted the Eucharist, and he established an ordinance for the church. Sometime during the Last Supper, Jesus also taught the disciples of servanthood and forgiveness as he washed his disciples' feet. And I would say, if no one else has anything else to add,
There's a lot of bread on the table. Is that representing the Eucharist? There's a lot of bread on the table, the individual loaves, and it strikes me that they're so evenly spaced along the table. Does that have more significance, or is that specifically the Eucharist?
I mean, I definitely think it's a direct reference to the Eucharist, the institution of the Eucharist. It's a good question. I haven't found anyone particularly, but now I see it since you pointed it out. It is very symmetrical and very evenly distributed.
Especially on the left.
Yeah. I don't know. But it's definitely a reference to the Eucharist, and also in the glasses, there's wine.
So you have the reference, so this is not narrative. Is that the controversy, or is that this is clear the other way to tell it?
Is there clear evidence? Sorry, it's just
Well, you have a reference on there that this is John, it's not Mary. Was that some subject of controversy, or just a clarification that some people mistaken?
Oh, yeah, no, that's, unfortunately, that was someone's mistake. I couldn't go in, so yes, yeah. So yeah, I kind of mentioned it like in the detail we can see that. And I just wanted to end with this, just briefly, just to visualize it. If we draw lines on top of the tapestry or the offers in the ceiling, they all in this is the horizon line. The vanishing point is right behind Christ's head. So there's obviously much more one can do, but I think we should, because of time, we should move on. Although before we go, I would like to leave you with the following question. What does the Eucharist mean to me? And then again, I think if someone wants to write a few things down, we can come back to it later, or if you would like to contemplate on that during the week. The second painting of the evening is Jesus washing Peter's feet by Ford Meadows Brown. This painting was painted 250 years later than the Last Supper, but it is similarly full of detailed expression of the disciples' feelings, of the rich color and symbols. Ford Meadows Brown was an English painter whose work was associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, although he was never a formal member. In 1448, young British painters formed the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, pursuing the goal to express a new moral seriousness and sincerity in their works. They were inspired by Italian art of the 14th and 15th century, depicting the direct and uncomplicated nature of Italian paintings before the High Renaissance, and in particular before the time of the Italian painter Raphael. Although the Brotherhood's active life lasted not quite 5 years, its influence on painting in Britain and ultimately on the decorative arts and interior design was profound, which eventually led to Art Nouveau and arts and crafts. Now let us focus on the painting again, and I will read a few sentences from the Gospel of John. John 13:4-9. I quote, Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around him, and began to wash his disciples' feet. Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." So again, with this reading in mind, I would like to invite some comments on this painting.
It looks like they're having a little celebration on the table. A few libations or something?
Yeah, so it's sometime during or after the Last Supper, again, so it's very, it's kind of the same situation we were in earlier. This might, no one really knows when it happened, if the washing was before or after, probably after the actual, probably before the actual dinner, so it's kind of not quite sure.
I never really thought of the age differential between Peter and Christ here. It looks a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the when we keep the Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper in mind and do have a direct comparison in our mind, I think that really helps to draw out also differences. Leonardo da Vinci's room is big and vast. This space is rather confined, it's kind of small, and also the perspective from our point of view is very different. I feel I could scooch right in and kneel next to Jesus and help him washing the feet of the disciples. I think that's an amazing perspective, actually, and we have to look up to see the faces of the disciples. If we would imagine ourselves kind of sitting right there.
it looks like Peter is eating some humble pie.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, again, I think I think there's multiple emotions. I think Peter is grumpy, he's unhappy with the situation that he's in. And why do you think that is? What was so telling about the situation Jesus put them in, or what Jesus actually did for them? I mean, it's a very...
I think that Peter was used to being in control, and he found himself in a place where he was no longer in control, because Jesus had said, I must wash you clean. I must wash the church clean. You have to depend on me in all situations, and I don't think Peter was ready for that. He was always trying to correct and reset the situation.
Yeah. So I think so too. I mean, Lily was saying Peter really wanted to, or wasn't quite ready to give up control. So he was used to that. And I think so too. And it's the act of washing the feet of the disciples is the level of humility. And it's because they were calling Jesus Lord, Master, and he was now the one who was taking the position of a servant. As we think back in history, this job was done by servants, and very much Jesus himself put himself into the place of a servant rather than of a master, because he wanted to understand that the disciples and we have to serve others and serve each other. And I found another quote somewhere while I was preparing for this session, and I thought it was very telling and beautiful. A quote: Jesus was humiliating himself in an act of loving humanity. And I thought that was very beautiful. And to interpret this painting a little bit more, I think we also have to see it as washing the feet not for cleaning's sake, but for washing away sin as we accumulate it. Because it was a festive activity, so probably everyone who arrived had taken a bath, but it was the symbol of just washing away the sin rather than an actual cleaning process.
Real quick question. Who's the kind of shadow figure who's right above Jesus? Who's kind of dark?
This one?
Yeah.
Yes. With this painting, we don't know exactly who everyone is. We know this is Peter, and we know this is Judas. I don't know who exactly is everyone, but it's similar to the Last Supper. Every one of these disciples expresses a different emotion. I mean, it's almost going from boredom to horror of the situation Jesus puts them in. There's surprise. So I think this painting, again, very much wants to tell us all the different emotions that we as humans will experience in a situation like that. We know that this is Judas, or we can think that, because again there's the money pouch right next to him with the gold coins.
Is another thing, this step, it seems like it might be kind of an odd place for a step. It's kind of right headed towards the table, and I don't know. It's interesting. It creates a different level, which is really neat. But yeah, which is kind of an interesting place for that scene.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, I think that's very special about this painting, that it is such a low perspective. Yeah.
I'm wondering how this washing of the feet is distinct from baptizing someone, like pouring say water on their head. But like, what does this mean? Why feet? What's significant about, say, the creator of the universe being incarnated and then washing the feet of his creatures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think baptism is more seen as the initial bringing someone into church and washing off kind of all your sin and the original sin that we all are born with. Washing the feet is a very specific, or is more a softer way of just washing off daily sins. And it is something that everyone can do to everyone. So the baptism is still reserved, mostly to priesthood. But washing the feet, the way Jesus introduced it, is something we can do to each other in a way of serving each other.
It's the epitome of service.
Right.
I worked as a public health nurse, and my job was to supervise the aides, and so I worked underneath the public health nurse. I have washed and cut a lot of toenails. It's a task that the nurses did not want to do, and I just think it's the epitome of being servant. And in those days, the feet were dirty. Sandals, not like the patients that I saw.
I love that. That's a beautiful, yes, the epitome of service. I like that. Yes.
I was just going to add that elsewhere in the Gospel of John, his Last Supper discourse, Jesus tells the apostles to remember that no servant is greater than his master. And what he means by that is, I'm your master, you're my servant. So if I'm willing to do this, sort of the job of a slave or a servant, you can never think of yourself as being greater than me when you go on with the rest of your lives and how you treat other people. So in addition to actually doing it, he's reminding them that you always have to remember that you're not greater than I am. So if I'm willing to do something like this, you have to be willing to do it to everybody that you encounter.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much. I love that. That's exactly how I felt about this painting too, and to the essence of the painting. Yes, Jesus sets an example to his disciples and to us. His disciples should wash each other's feet, and we should serve each other humbly. Jesus asked to live in humility and in love, to serve others rather than to expect to be waited on.
This artist gives him a halo. This artist gives him a halo. Where he lives with Vinci.
Right, that's right. Yeah. And I think that was artist's choice. Yeah. So I think we might want to move on. And again, I would like to leave you with the following question: how can I serve others better? Kind of an interesting fact, it just came to me, and just saw it in my note here. When Brown painted this picture the first time, Jesus wasn't wearing a lot of clothes, literally just a towel around his waist, and it created quite a stir in the 19th century. And it didn't sell until he reworked the figure of Jesus and put the clothing on. So, and then it was fine at that point. So our final painting of this evening is The Agony in the Garden by Paolo Veronese. Like many Italian artists, Veronese took his artistic name from his birthplace, and he was born in Verona in Italy. His actual name was Paolo Cagliari. Veronese was born in 1528, but he moved to Venice in 1550 and became one of the greatest Venetian painters of the 16th century. Together with Titian, whose painting The Temptation of Christ we saw last week, and the painter Tintoretto, Veronese created a body of work that defined the Venetian style. Veronese is best known for his exceptional use of brilliant colors, often executing extremely large historic paintings of religion and mythology. His paintings are feasts for the eye, since many of his works are full of majestic architectural settings and sumptuous detailed dresses and jewelry. This is a bit of an exception, but many of his paintings, particularly I think women like to look at his paintings. The women wear the most amazing dresses and pearls and golden necklaces, and their hair is absolutely beautiful. So he was definitely well known for that. Now I would like to invite you to focus on the Agony of the Garden, the Agony in the Garden, painted towards the end of Veronese's career, while I read a few sentences from the Gospel of Luke, Luke 22, 39 to 46. I quote, "He came out and went to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. He said to them, 'Pray that you may not come into the time of trial.' Then he withdrew, knelt down and prayed, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done.' Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping." So how maybe starting to, how is this composition, again, slightly different as what we have seen in the paintings before, particularly with the Last Supper.
So back to my question about the colors on the robes. This is the same as the Last Supper, right? The red and the blue. So is this a direct reference to the Last Supper, or is there a larger tradition that uses these specific colors?
Yeah, I think it's a larger tradition. So because the blue ultramarine was so expensive, so you think it was the most expensive pigment that one could use in a painting. So it was really always reserved for the most important person or the most important figure. Again, with this and red was, I mean, you could pull the reference red for blood, for life, but those two pigments were usually reserved for either Christ, if he was depicted in it, or Mary. Very often would wear those two colors as well.
So then would the blue be like the divine nature and the red the human nature?
You kind of, it's a very interesting question. I will look this up.
Isn't it important for these artists to kind of understand the theology in their minds? Like, for example, from the Italian Renaissance, Dante was very much like a Thomist following Aquinas, and he understood the world in those terms. And I'm wondering, these artists, like, I'm not familiar with this one, but I'm wondering, like, what's like the meaning? Like how is what does he want to express? Not like necessarily what the pigments are, what emotions the faces show, but like what's like the biggest macro picture that this artist wants to really show to the world? artists were very devout, very much immersed in this Italian Renaissance Catholic worldview, and that's how they saw their entire world. And they were trying to say something speaking from that world, right?
Right, but I think to make that visible, what they felt, they would give that person that's the most important, the most precious. And I think that again kind of, I really believe that comes back right with reserving the blue, which was so expensive to represent Jesus or Christ or God. Because since there is a wonderful series in the National Gallery in London, and it's on YouTube, where they speak about the difficulty that artists had to depict Jesus as fully human and fully divine. And they go into that a little bit, but I still think it's not, it would be interesting if you would look at that and see if they can answer your question. Because it's obviously very difficult to do that. How do you depict a fully divine person that's out of our reach, but you still want to depict it for us to see that? And I think it's just one way of doing it. You can do it by space, but also it's reserving the most personal materials for that person.
Well, and you can also notice that this artist is struggling to depict divinity and humanity because we have this very human pose of Jesus. He's practically fainting, and yeah, he's bathed in light. So light being that universal sort of sign of divinity or godliness, but obviously the artist is never going to be able to completely capture God, just like St. Augustine writes in the City of God.
Yeah, I love this one because actually my kind of summary at the end, it comes exactly to this. I felt Veronese was actually expressing a little bit more of the human side of Jesus. I think in this situation, Jesus was realizing what was coming his way, that he was going through the passion, and he knew he was going to die. And I think that's, even for the Son of God, was a lot to bear. And so I think Veronese really, in this painting, shows potential fear, anxiety that Jesus was feeling during that moment. And compared to the other two paintings, I think it was, even though it's still depicted as a person, but I think it was more the divine side of Jesus. He was in control, he was calm, and he was leading his disciples. I agree. I think just the discussion is wonderful, exactly leading to the points that I wanted to make by choosing these paintings. And it's also the Holy Spirit is kind of shining on him to give him further strength to get through the situation, through the passion that is coming his way.
And with the disciples asleep already, it shows the betrayal of everyone.
Yes. So the time Veronese painted this painting, obviously the agony in the garden had been depicted many times. And if one would look through the chronology of these paintings, it's very interesting that you point that out. In many earlier paintings, the disciples were in the forefront, and then they kind of moved on the same plane as Jesus, and then Veronese was the first one to really push him into the back. again, I think to kind of highlight more the emotions that Jesus was going through. But yeah, I think there's multiple ways of interpreting this. So they might have been just completely overwhelmed with what Jesus had just told them. I think I always try to put myself into the situation that someone is going through. There was a lot to take on during that night, and they might have just, at that point, just been exhausted. Another potential interpretation is that they also might have not really understood what was going on, and even though they had heard Jesus saying it, but they haven't really understood it. Another interpretation might be, well, they might have been ignorant. I mean, I doubt that, but that could be. And there was just so much involved in their own lives, and again, they just kind of fell asleep. So we know that the apostles, they were Peter, John, and James, and they had come with Jesus that night.
So, in the tradition of Christian iconography and symbolic or allegorical interpretation or analogical interpretation of the Bible, sleep is spiritual death. So that's, I think, kind of past the sort of like literal meaning that they're like actually depicted as sleeping. One of the primary meanings generally throughout the entire Christian tradition is sleep is death or spiritual death.
Yeah, that's.
I was also just going to say that they had just celebrated Passover together. And I imagine, getting inside the significance of the Last Supper, that every year when Jews celebrated the Passover, there was probably a lot of wine that was consumed. And so, from a purely physical standpoint, if they had just drank a lot of wine, that could have contributed to their drowsiness. I was just going to say, the use of red in terms of clothing for Jesus at the Last Supper with Da Vinci and this one, if you go to daily Mass, on feast days of martyrs, the priest wears red. I'm sure that priests have been wearing red on martyr feast days for hundreds of years. And so the use of red on Jesus by the artist may have also been symbolic of the fact that he was at the Last Supper and the agony in the garden, he was going to shed his blood soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah.
You mentioned lapis lazuli for the basis of the blue and being very expensive. What is the basis of the red?
Right, so I agree with what you have said, and I kind of mentioned that earlier before. I think it is probably a representation of blood, and red pigment comes probably kind of next in the line of being expensive, and so I think a combination of things, of the symbolism, but also the precious, being a precious pigment. That combination elevated the color to be used for Christ. So just in terms, it's just running short of time here. But I think I really much enjoyed it, and I think all the three works of art of tonight focus extensively on the depiction of the different human emotions. We saw contempt, sadness, anger, dismay, surprise, shame, and humility. These three paintings tonight show us that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. And as we said in the Last Supper and Jesus washing Peter's feet, Jesus is calm and content, and he trusts in God. However, Veronese shows us that Jesus was also fully human at the same time, with human feelings and human emotions. And I wish you enjoyed tonight. And the last question I would like to leave you with is, am I staying awake to understand the meaning of Easter? Thank you very much.